All right, welcome to another episode of the Credder Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Palmieri, and with me today is one of my dear friends, Mickey Huff. Mickey is one of the world's most recognized critical media literacy educators and is currently serving as the president of the nonprofit Media Freedom Foundation and director of Project Censored. And for those of you that don't know, Project Censored is a nonprofit media watchdog founded in 1976, which has a nationally syndicated radio show and podcast, of which I am actually Mickey's co-host. And last but not least, Mickey is one of Credder's advisors and was a big help in crafting the unique review process being used to rate articles on Credder today. Mickey, thanks for being here.
Chase, it's always a delight to talk to you, and congratulations on your new podcast, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you. I hope to use all the skills I've learned with you on the Project Censored show. I wanted to start with you diving into the phrase fake news. So the idea of discrediting journalists is nothing new, but in the last few years, this particular phrase, has dominated every discussion having to do with the record levels of distrust in media today. What do you think about the term fake news?
Well, Chase, again, thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation. There's several things to say about this, of course, and we've been filling books with it, with our thoughts about it for some time. But fake news serves multiple purposes, and fake news as a term, it's not new. And if you go back historically, you can go back a couple centuries easily. The idea of there being fake stories or hoax stories after the printing press, that's always been a thing. But perhaps more insidiously, there's always been a tendency to want to control narratives. And so those that control the means of production of information dissemination then usually have a stake in what they're producing and the messages that they're putting forward. It often behooves them to capture the narrative and such that anything that is not coming through those particular medium or platforms can be delegitimized or questioned. Now, a rather sort of blunt way of putting it would be to say that it's, quote, fake news. And I say that because we've been enduring a presidency of the last 4 years where the chief executive of the United States has very effectively weaponized the term fake news in a very simplistic way, where if someone is saying something that where there's disagreement or they don't want to hear it, they just say, well, that's fake news. That's not true. But what's at root there is actually more complicated and problematic. So the weaponization of the term fake news is something that we've certainly seen over the 20th century. In fact, if you go back to Germany in World War I under the Kaiser, even in World War II under Hitler, the phrase Lügenpresse meant the false press or the lying media, the lying press, right? And then that translates into fake news, right? Propaganda. It's a delegitimation of information. And so while the term isn't new, what it really is propaganda and disinformation. Now, about 10, 15 years ago in the US, the term fake news started to mean satire. So it was, tongue-in-cheek, The Onion or Stephen Colbert's, the Colbert Report or Jon Stewart's Daily Show, where fake news was seen as this whole genre, right? And it was a clever genre because it tended to mirror or imitate certain kinds of corporate media propaganda that people that wanted to believe the message would wonder, like Bill O'Reilly, whom Stephen Colbert lampooned and mocked, right? But some of these people at first thought that Colbert was really a conservative, even though it was cartoonishly obvious that he was lampooning or mocking people. But it really kind of opened up this can of worms. One person's fake news is another person's truthful path, if you will. But the 2016 election is really where things ramped up, Chase. You say the fake news term in a context where we've been hearing it now almost nonstop for several years, right?
Right.
And so in its current iteration, it's at once been weaponized. So originally, Hillary Clinton, the Democrats, and the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, used that label about Russian influence and Trump's use of fake news to win the election. But very quickly, and Trump is very adept at this. Remember, he's a media guy. He's a reality TV celebrity with 14 seasons, right? Trump knows how to use media and use messaging and social media. And so he quickly took that term that was being leveled against him and he spun it around. And it wasn't hard to do because he could easily point to flaws in the major corporate media. He could easily point to corruption and flaws in Democratic National Committee's own messaging campaigns. And so what he was saying wasn't even technically false in context, but he then used took great liberties with the term to make it mean anything with which he disagreed. And that's where we have the ultimate apex of the problem of post-truth, right? In 2016, Oxford Dictionary declared post-truth word of the year, hyphenated term of the year, which really alludes to an epistemological crisis or truth emergency, as we've called it at Project Censored, whereby the truth is what we think it is based on our feelings, our emotions, and our own confirmation biases. And there's that term again, right? The deeper problem behind fake news isn't that we are in an information war, which is a problem, but it's that when we only use our own compass to determine what we think the truth is based on our own interests, we may not be accurate empirical observers of the world around us. And that sets us up for being duped or being deceived. And it may even make us unwitting propagandists of our own, even if we don't see ourselves that way. So I know that's not a concise sort of response to your first question, but I suspect that will lay the groundwork for the other things that you want to discuss. And then particularly getting into why is Credder a really great vehicle to address this challenge that we face. So I'm open to wherever you'd like to take it from there.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the narrative and how crucial winning the narrative has become for either political parties or individual pundits. So this idea of setting the narrative, it's been really hard to see people change their opinions once the narrative is set. And when I was in university, I actually took a course on consciousness. And it seems to me that this has a lot to do with how the human mind has adapted to learning through storytelling, as opposed to gathering up individual pieces of information. So kind of dating back to our oral traditions when stories were the only way to pass information down from generation to generation. Would you agree that narrative thinking is deeply built into how we think as a species, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, we're storytellers. We live stories, we tell stories. Our lives are stories. And the interesting thing about stories is that the storyteller may have intent or multiple intentions, but the audience may have many differing perspectives. Right. And of course, that's part of the issue with the post-truth conundrum, is it tries to, in postmodernist fashion, nullify intent and context. And then it leans more heavily on confirmation bias. And then I will seek out information that I nod in agreement to, whereas I won't have my sensibilities or my worldviews challenged. And you mentioned university or higher education. Well, the prime objective of higher education is to think differently, think critically, be exposed to ideas and experiences other than your own provincial upbringing, right? Whatever that may have been or may be. And so by day, among the other things I do with Project Censored, I'm a professor. I'm co-chair of the history department at the Diablo Valley College in the San Francisco Bay Area. I teach courses on political economy, social science. I'm chair of the journalism program there as well. And there's a real connection to me between journalism and his history and the construction of historical narrative. In fact, into the 20th century, you go back through several luminary characters, including the Grahams at the Washington Post and so on, over 50 years ago, talked about journalism as the first rough draft of history. That's a lot of pressure, but it's also one of the only professions, or an industry, of course, that's protected by the Constitution, right, under the First Amendment, so that we cannot have government interference. Notice that doesn't mean that we can't have corporate interference or other types of interference that seek to control those various narratives that are then cast out in society. But let me go back just for a moment to your riff on the narrative creation, because we are storytellers. His story, well, history has often been told by men. What about her story? What about our story? What about their story? What about the meta story? It's important that we do need to realize that there are more important, let me scratch that word, important. There are different ways to tell stories other than in a linear way or a linear fashion. And there are different ways to tell stories that don't just have binaries like protagonists and antagonists. But our news cycle tends to really kind of distill itself down to these very basic elements because it is a private for-profit industry. 5 corporations now own about 90% of it in the United States, and they're competing for eyeballs to sell to advertisers, whether it's on cable, networks, public broadcasting, which is mostly corporate funded, or the ever-expanding world of the internet, right, and applications on digital devices. And so what we think at Project Censored, and what I teach about in a lot of my classes about narrative construction, is one of the most important things to look at is who's telling the story. As we go back into the 1980s and the propaganda model from Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, they talk about ownership and advertising and newsmakers and shapers and influencers as who determines what is newsworthy. The prime objective of the news company is to make profits from advertisers, and they rely on people in the society that are experts, that are going to tell us what's really going on, as George Seldes would say journalism should do in the 20th century. But rather what happens is these corporate platforms end up being public relations vehicles for advertisers and for newsmakers and shapers to get their agendas out there. Who's not getting an agenda? Well, whoever isn't getting invited to the platform. A.J. Liebling in the 20th century once said that the best way to guarantee freedom of the press is to own one. Well, that flies in the face of the free press sensibility, right? And it flies in the face of the Society for Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. So we have a lot of our work cut out for us, Chase, but it's very important to remember that at the root or at the core of this storytelling is critical literacy, critical media literacy, and critical pedagogy, because we have to ask these questions. Who's telling the story? Why do they want me to know it? Who's a character in the story, and how are they defined? Who's not in the story? What stories are not being told? What challenges or counter narratives are being left out, and why? So just that path alone, and that's again one of the sort of core paths that critical media literacy scholars focus on, is they don't just teach people how to interact with media or how to interact with devices or gadgets or applications or how to use Credder, for example, but they also, and this is what I like about Credder, is that you got to go another layer and another layer deep. It's not just what are the platforms, what are the aggregators, and what are the sites to go to. It's why and what are they telling me, and how can I use critical thinking, basic understanding of informal logical fallacies, asking the right questions. How can I do that to be sure that the journalism that I'm getting is adhering to these major ethics from the Society of Professional Journalism, which is to be independent, to be transparent, to not cause harm, right? These are major tenets of journalism. So how do we make sure they're being upheld? Well, it's to ask critical questions. And again, one of the things that I know that the folks over at Credder.com do is they really ask the critical questions about the stories that you're interfacing with, and it gives readers the opportunity, as well as content producers and journalists, to all interface with each other and have a dialogue. There's the magic word. Storytelling is not just a one-way street. It's a dialogue, and the more voices we bring in from all the people that are participants are not just bystanders and are not just people in the peanut gallery. And democracy is not a spectator sport. And we need journalism as a platform to allow us not only to exercise our rights for expression, but to hear the most diverse views in our society, to be able to freely decide what we think is going on based on our understandings, and then enhance the understandings of ourselves and others in the process.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And to stick with the narrative thinking, a lot of the narratives outside of the mainstream are painted as conspiracy theories. Can you already gave us a little bit of a background on the term fake news. Why don't you give listeners a little bit of a brief history run through for the term conspiracy theorist, that label?
Yeah, at Project Censored, we've done a lot of stories that are controversial, and those are the kind of stories that tend to be underreported or censored in the corporate press because they're most likely to offend somebody. And I don't just mean anybody. It's most likely to offend the financial sector, a certain corporate sector, a certain industry, the military-industrial complex, shareholders, advertisers. So there's a lot of curation, that kind of goes on in corporate media. And among the things that are curated are any kind of pesky stories that challenge official narratives that are not well constructed. So anytime you have, controversial events or very complicated events, it's not uncommon for the establishment, for government agencies, and for the corporate media to kind of want to distill it for people, right? And look, let's put on our good-natured hat for a moment, right? It's not that these agencies or these outlets are constantly looking to deceive people or are out to wreck people or claim global dominance. I would certainly suggest that in some cases they surely are. But that doesn't mean that you don't get good reporting from major outlets. And that doesn't mean that government agencies are constantly out to deceive people by controlling narratives. They are, however, interested in it. And when you get a controversial event like September the 11th, or how about we even bring it closer to the present with all of the post-election commentary about not just election fraud, but more troublesome voter fraud. Now, there's a big difference. Election fraud is systemic, which is long-term, widespread, whether it's cybersecurity issues or not counting all the votes, hacking in cyberspace. Those are big problems that have been documented. But voter fraud means that you show up and you're pretending to be somebody else, or you're casting a ballot for a dead person. Now, has that happened in our history? Yes. Does it happen often? Almost never. In fact, statistically, it's infinitesimal. But we do have documentation of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even more votes either not being counted or being swapped in cyberspace. I digress. Back to this latest charge after the Trump-Biden election. Trump is claimed to be the winner and claimed that there was voter fraud. Well, there was voter suppression. There's gerrymandering. But the stories of ballots being thrown out, that story from Erie, the postal worker said he lied. The other story about voter suppression that voting fraud that Tucker Carlson was peddling, he admitted he had no evidence for recently. But that's in line with what we know historically. So let me take that topic and hit it with the conspiracy theory label, right? So a lot of folks, instead of analyzing it, will say that's just some crazy conspiracy theory. Just like people will do from the other side when you're talking about election fraud, which is far more documented. The real issue here is that labels prevent people from actually analyzing arguments, right? That's the main problem with conspiracy theory labels, fake news labels. The whole purpose is to get somebody to reject an argument a priori where they will be dissuaded from even considering it, right? And so what we've done at Project Censored is say that, look, not all conspiracies are created equal. Some of them have factual evidence to support them. Some of them are wanton speculation. What do we do with those? Let's get them out of the way. Let's openly debate, discuss them. Let's debunk and disprove them and focus on areas where there are factual discrepancies or real issues to discuss and debate. right? Not just my confirmation bias versus your confirmation bias. And then I go to my media filter bubble and you go to your hyper-partisan bubble, and neither one of us is communicating in a way that we're ever going to get to each other, right? We're just repeating the things that we want to hear for ourselves. And what we do at Project Censored is we try to look at information and veracity, integrity. Susan Merritt, a library scholar in our Censored 2019 book, wrote a really stellar chapter at the end that gives us a pedagogical framework to understand this. It's called The Public and Its Problems, Fake News and the Battle for Hearts and Minds. She wrote another book in our Censored 2017 book on contested visions, fake news, and the persistence of conspiracy theory. Oh, and this goes back to historians like Catherine Olmsted at UC Davis that said, well, part of the reason that the American public is prone to believe in conspiracies is because we have a documented history of our news media and government getting caught lying to the public. So you'd have to be a fool to simply believe everything at face value on one level, but on the other level, we have to trust but verify. It's not healthy for a society to be in a place where we nearly are now, where it's red and blue, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. And if it doesn't fit one of those little square pegs to the round hole, then nobody wants to hear it. Well, again, reality is more complicated and nuanced than that. And so our research usually says, look, I don't want to dissuade people from researching a subject. I just want people to be able to have the critical thinking skills enough to ask the right questions so that they can ascertain on their own whether something is worth their time and worth them bothering to believe in at the end of the day, right? And I mentioned 9/11, right? 19 years on. There are wanton conspiracy theories about 9/11 that are buttressed by no facts. Then there are others that are actually quite substantially supported, like support coming from Pakistan and the Saudi government to finance hijackers on 9/11. The fact that the United States received numerous warnings and the CIA warned the Bush administration numerous times, and those warnings were not heeded at all, in fact, ignored. So I like to focus on the things that are more demonstrable rather than fan the flames of things that we just don't know. But there's a whole cottage industry that fans the flames, Chase, and you know this. The Alex Joneses, the InfoWars, even to some extent, even Breitbart, right? Look, Nolan Higdon and I in United States of Distraction, we wrote about this and we looked at network media and we looked at cable media and we even found versions of it there, right? We found outlandish, factless things peddled at Fox News, right? Like birtherism and Obama and these kind of things. But guess what we found over at MSNBC and Rachel Maddow? We found the endless specter of Russiagate. You said it. The endless specter of Russia, Russia, Russia. Well, guess what? Anybody that bothers to go and do the research and take a look at it sees that that's a lot of hot air. It's a lot of circumstantial evidence. And at the end of the day, one of the most recent incarnations of that was bounties being placed on the heads of U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. And it turns out that was all hearsay. It was sourced anonymously down to one person in the Taliban. There was no corroboration of it, no external confirmation. The media sources that reported it even admitted it. And yet the story just got repeated over and over and over again, as if you repeat it more often, it suddenly becomes true. That's the problem with fake news. That's the problem with propaganda. And that's why conspiracy theories are so troublesome, is they're easy to repeat. And people want to glom onto the sensationalism. It's far less sexy to spend hours and hours reading, researching, questioning, and admitting what we don't know, right? And it's much more exciting to click, like, and share and get a rise out of everybody at the dinner table, right? You're no stranger to that. And so we do try to influence the way people think in the construction, not what the outcome is, but here are ways to think rationally and look at media sources. Here are questions to ask about certain sources. And let's also remember broken clocks are right twice a day. Just because I mentioned some people here earlier that don't have great track records for accurately reporting things doesn't mean everything they've ever reported is wrong, any more than it means that the Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times doesn't write fake news, because they have. They peddled WMD nonsense. They had Jason Blair working there, who was literally making up stories whole cloth for years. So this is why we need critical media literacy education. This is why we don't want to outsource that, because we talk about fake news. In all of this landscape of fake news, what we've seen from the social media companies and Congress is the politicians saying, we want to fight fake news, and the social media companies saying, we're not involved with that. That's not our fault. But then in retaliation, right, the Congress is pressuring social media companies to say, you better fix your platforms. And so what do these platforms do? Well, they start censoring people. And look, one side always loves it when you censor the other. But guess what happens? As soon as you allow the deplatforming of Alex Jones, you open the floodgates to deplatform Counterpunch or Naked Capitalism or Mint Press News. And that's what we have now, is a mass deplatforming on social media for censorship, all in the name of allegedly fighting fake news. You've got algorithms doing it, bots doing it, outsourcing people doing it, the Atlantic Council from NATO doing it, Snopes doing it. Look, there's no substitute for critical media literacy education and people being taught how to critically examine news and information on their own. We have a whole chapter in Censored 2020 Through the Looking Glass on how fighting fake news has been used as a Trojan horse for censorship. And at Project Censored, we are opposed to censorship. We believe that people have the ability to make these determinations on their own. Nolan Higdon's new book on the anatomy of fake news has a fake news detection kit on a critical news literacy. So this is our approach. This is the way we think we should be combating fake news propaganda and disinformation, which also is highlighted in our brand new documentary called United States of Distraction, Fighting the Fake News Invasion, that's online for free at projectcensored.org. And Chase, you actually have a nice 3-minute public service announcement at the end of the film talking about the importance of Credder as sort of an open market or a free market potential solution to some of the challenges we face with crowd contested media.
Right, I think you said it. Conspiracy theories are just sexier than thinking critically about news. It's just more fun. It's more sexy. But like you said, at Credder, what we're trying to do is bring sexy back to the media literacy side of things. So hopefully having a kind of a cool platform like that where people can work together does make media literacy and critical media literacy more fun and more frictionless for people. I want to talk about the canary in the coal mine, who is Alex Jones that you mentioned. He, a second ago, we were talking about the conspiracy theorist label. Now I can't read anything about Alex Jones where he's mentioned in a piece where it doesn't say Alex Jones at InfoWars and conspiracy theorist. That tagline is almost 100% of the time attached to his name now. And we also know that he was one of the first people to be deplatformed on Facebook and Twitter and all these other social media platforms. And that's because he was one of the voices that both the left and the right were kind of like, yeah, I'm not going to really step up to protect that person. And so as students of censorship and these types of issues, we know that that is the logical first domino to fall. And so can you speak a little bit more about how Alex Jones being deplatformed and nobody stepping up to defend him actually opens the door for this censorship of further right or further left wing people on those platforms?
Yeah, Noam Chomsky once said that you could have two positions on free speech, which I would extend to free expression or free press, and that's you're either for it or you're not. I mean, that's obviously binary and simplistic and reductionist on one level, but there's some serious truth in that statement, and you're absolutely correct. Alex Jones was the perfect whipping boy for, quote, both sides, right? As somebody that a lot, particularly establishment liberals and conservatives, were happy to see thrown under the bus, right? But that was a big trial balloon, right? The trial balloon went up. There was great applause from that myopic establishment, sort of center. And Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, Google, and the rest, they all kind of took notes and they said, I wonder who else we can deplatform. And naturally, they went after the independent press. So that means they're going to go people who are not in the myopic corporate center, liberal conservative. You can have wildly different degrees between Biden and Trump. Their foreign policies are very similar. Their fiscal policies are pretty similar. But you can argue about gay rights all day. And this looks very different. And Kamala Harris and Mike Pence have very different views about women's rights. And true enough. But there's a lot of other ideas that are totally outside that myopic realm of legitimate controversy that's formed by the corporate press and government that are really problematic, that independent journalists challenge on a regular basis. And in doing so, they at least inadvertently call out the failures of the establishment press, as well as government watchdogs. Guess who doesn't like that? Governments and the so-called free press, meaning the corporate press. So they will happily agree. They will applaud and say, we got to curate this stuff. We can't just have any Yahoo on our programs. And then they'll have Giuliani on for the 100th time, right? Or they'll have somebody else on that spews half-baked theories and ideas that are not buttressed by facts at all on the regular, right? So that's really troublesome. But what independent journalists do, and why it's important for the corporate media to silence those voices, is just because what I just said. They not only call out major critiques of the entire corporate structure and the duopoly of the two-party system, whether it's libertarian right or socialist, Marxist, anarchist left, they point out what the public is missing in the analysis. They don't have political economic analysis. They don't have deep-rooted historical context in the reporting. And as a result, then the corporate media is shown as the propaganda organ for the establishment that it actually is. And so the deplatforming of those marginalized independent sources is exactly what came next, Chase, and you know it. Right after the deplatforming of Alex Jones, 800 sites were tanked within a month, right? And it wasn't just getting tanked off social media. Google was starting to shadow ban and bury groups in their rankings, right? So that you wouldn't even show up or couldn't even see yourself in Google searches anymore. So the algorithms of oppression are real. Algorithms are written by people who are flawed, that have their own confirmation bias. And therefore, the algorithms and bots that are helping to curate our information are only as good as the imperfect people that have agendas that create them. So it's yet another layer of insidious curation and censorship taking place, ironically, in the name of trying to save us from loons like Alex Jones. I'll tell you what. I'll take my chances against Alex Jones any day of the week with my own critical faculties before I outsource it to somebody at the Atlantic Council at Facebook. That's the PR arm of NATO.
Right. And so let's talk about social media censorship and how it's playing out today. So I think even today, right now, today is Tuesday, November 17th, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg and Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey are in front of congressional Republicans being asked the hard questions about why, President Trump's tweets about election fraud are being labeled, why certain people's tweets are being taken down. There's the example of the New York Post story, which was very blatantly pulled down from the entire site. Is the answer pulling? I mean, I know we agree that the answer is not pulling content down, but there's really only a few options, right? So there's pulling content down, which we would disagree with. There's labeling content as potentially inappropriate or incorrect or unfactual, or there's just leaving it all alone and trusting that people can figure it out. Where do you land on that? Do you think labels is an appropriate solution?
I think labeling is a slippery slope. Of course, I oppose censorship, so that's easy. That's an easy one to discard. I also think that there are problems with the Wild West, pun intended, Silicon Valley, anything goes ethos, right? Sort of the idea that, well, we'll just let anything happen, right? I mean, that's what Dorsey's been criticized at Twitter, right? And Zuckerberg's been criticized at Facebook for having differing views of those sorts over the years. Look, let's be honest, they're an industry like any other, and they're trying to avoid being regulated. Those folks, they're anything but dumb. they get this, and they're trying to do a really skillful tightrope dance here, right? The problem is that who suffers and who's getting punched out in the middle is us. It's the public, right? So what I would argue is this. If we have a truly vibrant free press, coupled with an open public sphere and a robustly funded public education and media system, where critical media literacy is a big part of education with critical thinking, critical pedagogy, cultural competency, empathy, communications training for critical listening and dialogue, I think that we should be modeling the long-term benefits of keeping the conversation going. That's part of the solution. It's not here's truth.com and fakenews.com. It's there are likely people on many different sides of issues that have factual support and some truth to their perspective based on their experiences that we all need to consider. But what we need to do is have a publicly transparent way of saying, where does your belief begin and your factual analysis end, right? And that's what we need to be able to do collectively. And so if we could do this, we can walk and chew gum. If our news media system wasn't based on sensationalist ratings, I teach classes on critical thinking where I have students, they'll go and even reverse engineer an independent story. They'll take, for example, they'll take, our new book is coming out December 1st. It's called Project Censored, State of the Free Press, 2021, a great foreword by Matt Taibbi. I could take a story out of here and say, Monsanto has intelligence centers that targeted journalists and activists. Well, that's not a surprise to you or me. Why are they targeting journalists and activists? Because they don't want them researching their business practices and environmental practices because it's very negative PR for them, right? So what my students will do is they'll reverse engineer a story like that. They'll be like, where was that story published? Who published it? Did the corporate media publish that story? No. Why ever not? And then they start going down the path of the critical media literacy questions, the propaganda model. So they're not only learning about Monsanto, they're learning about power structures, they're learning about media framing, they're learning about, quote, news judgment that's apparently, maybe more connected to Monsanto as a big advertiser or having people sit on crossboards of directorships than facts and evidence, right? And so the students begin learning that, and then they go back and tell the story, and they do 15 or 20-minute presentations about the story, the background. They analyze it. They show us where the story was covered and how, if so. So you tell me, if I can have a group of 18 to 22-year-olds for traditional college age, and then obviously non-traditional beyond, but if I can do that at a 20,000 student school in the San Francisco Bay Area, and my students can come up with absolutely incredible 20-minute segments that teach the whole class about that story, why can't CBS? Why can't ABC? Why can't PBS? Why can't C-SPAN? Why can't CNN? Well, I tell you why. It's because they won't. It's not because they can't. It's because they won't and they don't. Because they're not about telling the public what's going on. They're about curating the information. The intellectual abilities are there. The curiosity and healthy skepticism is there. People going through journalism school, they know this. But when they get into these hard-to-get jobs in the establishment media, they know the unwritten rules. You know what to say, you know what not to say. You don't have to have a poster on the wall that says, don't interview Alex Jones. Any reporter worth their salt will see what's happening to the Titanic over there, and they will know that if they want to hitch their career to a sinking ship, they'll go ahead and do it. Now, otherwise, they'll keep their job and keep their mouths shut and focus on another story and another source. That's self-censorship, which is a huge problem of this market type of journalism, right? Is that people self-censor. Christina Borgeson has written a couple of great books on this. She's a fantastic journalist. Feet to the Fire, one of her great books about this. Journalists speaking out about their own issues of censorship. This is a rampant problem. This is not just a few bad apples. Self-censorship is a huge problem across the news industry. And that's why I'm going to say this again. I do not want to outsource critical thinking, and I do not want these agencies telling me what is fake or real news. What I want them to do is to use their column inches and their airtime in the public interest to give me diverse views based on transparently sourced evidence that they can present in a reasonable fashion in a timely way in the day. It's not just the nightly news anymore, Chase, right? It's 24/7. They'd have to create a fourth dimension to make more time. They don't need more time. They need more courage. They need civil courage to listen to the canaries in the coal mine. Not just Alex Jones, who's getting deplatformed as a message to us to not censor people, but what about the canaries in the coal mine like the hacked up Khashoggi, right? Where you can have foreign governments kidnap and hack up journalists into pieces because they don't like their reporting in the Washington Post. What about Julian Assange, who languishes in prison as a whistleblower in England? He's in prison for telling the truth and for promoting the publication of government documents that show their own lies and deception that the public does have a right to know, right? Those are the canaries in the coal mine, the Assanges, the Chelsea Mannings, the reality winners. Those are the people that are trying to tell us that big tech is not necessarily our friend. Surveillance Valley, the age of surveillance capitalism. We've got a lot of challenges coming from the tech sector that we need to take very seriously. And the one popularization of this challenge in the social media world about the new Social Dilemma documentary on Netflix, I think is a nice shot across the bow for people who weren't paying any attention, but it doesn't go nearly deeply enough to show us the very pernicious, insidious problems that exist in Silicon Valley and in this technology. And by the way, I would argue that a flip side of what Silicon Valley can do is that they can support endeavors that are crowd contested in the public interest, like Credder. They could sink effort and energy into critical media literacy education institutions and nonprofits, like the Media Freedom Foundation or Project Censored, right? Or like even the San Francisco Public Press or Pacifica Radio, for example. There's a lot of ways that they can show that they're interested in a public press and media. We just have to pressure them so that they'll actually do it. So the long answer you have there, the short answer is I'm going to go right back to it and say, and this is what Nolan Higdon and I argue in United States of Distractions, this is what Amy Lee Roth and I argue in the Project Censored book every year: critical thinking, critical pedagogy, critical media literacy. If we did it nationwide, if we did it K through 12, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in, because we'd have an entire generation of people that grew up learning about how to interact with media, better yet, maybe even learning how to be the media themselves in a responsible way that builds our understanding. It doesn't, in other words, it tears walls down, doesn't build them up.
So you're on the inside, you're teaching critical media literacy almost on a daily basis and have been for years. Are you seeing a ramping up of these types of curriculum in the K through 12 or university level?
The silver lining of the popularization of the fake news moniker has led to well-intentioned initiatives. Saying, like, right, even in California with Bill Dodd, and I consulted with him on the media literacy bill a couple of years back, because again, it's because of this fake news off leash issue that all of a sudden, again, everybody was sort of like, hey, wait, there's a problem here. What's going on? We can't trust the media? What's going on? Okay, so the problem with that on one level is that we don't want to just have rampant dysfunctional distrust of everything. We want to have a metric by which we can measure the success and the veracity of these institutions that disseminate information to us in the free press, in the journalistic world. So we can do that. But we need to have earnest educational efforts that aren't just about Scholastic and Nickelodeon and Google dumping a bunch of money in the K-12 curriculum so that the schools adopt their software and their gadgets to outsource the thought for them. Or NewsGuard, where it'll put a warning sign and curate the news source. So they'll say, well, this is a warning. This might not be true. Okay. I guess that I get that the warning might cause someone to think critically so that they do more thinking and more research. But you know what labeling does? It's a shortcut. It allows someone to say, NewsGuard's pretty reputable. They said this site is fake news. I'm not going to go there anymore, right? But if you go and see what NewsGuard does, mysteriously, Fox News has a green light badge. ABC has a green light badge. So if you're a corporate establishment, you're A-okay. If you're in the independent press and you challenge that system, you get a yellow or red flag from NewsGuard, right? So they show their biases from their funding. That's exactly what critical media literacy pedagogy does. That's the kind of pedagogy we need in schools. And that's the kind of education that I don't think we're seeing rolled out, Chase. But we do have an opportunity that now that this is on the radar, when I talk about media literacy and critical media literacy, people's faces don't just kind of whiten and glaze over, right? People kind of chime up and say, yeah, media literacy, I've heard of that. Now they may have differing ideas about what it is, but that does give us an invitation to say, I'd like to talk more about that with you. Where do you get your media literacy information? Well, we go to Snopes and we go here, and I say, that's very interesting. So what do you get out of that site? Well, it helps me understand the false stories. Who then at that end of the spectrum is being vetted? Who watches the watchers? Who curates the curators, right? And at Project Censored, that's been one of the questions that we've asked for a long time. And we think people should do that regardless of where they fall on the ideological spectrum, right? We can have people on the left that are very interested in facts and truthful reporting, just like we can have people on the right. And I mean, people like Cheryl Atkinson and her new book Slanted come to mind, right? Where she talks about how people learn to love censorship and hate journalism as the subtitle for her new book. Now, you know, Cheryl is more conservative, right? But yet you have a really interesting situation where she's also a big supporter of Project Censored. It's probably the only time you'll ever see my name and Sean Hannity's name on a book at the same time, right? But that's because I'm promoting the idea that we have open discussion and we have factual reporting. And when we don't, we need to call it out. How do we do that? You got to start in the schools. You got to start K-12. You got to start teaching people as part of parenting what is wise or best practice use for all these digital devices, right? How much screen time is too much screen time, as we say in a pandemic, over a screen? What are some things we should be thinking about using Zoom or Google Classroom? This is what critical media literacy does. And until recently, excuse me, most educational institutions weren't even paying lip service to this stuff. So it's been great for us at Project Censored that people are kind of curious about this. And we're saying, like, we've been doing this for 45 years. We're happy to talk to you about it. But likewise at Project Censored, we're very happy to see organizations like Credder come on the scene that are saying, you know, this isn't just for the academy. This isn't just for public schools. Media and journalism is a classroom and is a teacher. And all of the people that use those platforms can be students. And you have that model with crowd contested media that each of the students on the platform is going to say, here's what I think about this story that makes sense and why. Here's what I don't think is making sense and why. And then you can have this vibrant, you know, kind of rich dialogue where there's opportunity for people to disagree, but they can agree to disagree and understand why and build on that understanding, which is what media ecosystems can do when they are acting in the best interest of the public and when they do what they do best. Right. And we need to use them that way, and we need to hold them accountable.
Right. And when we started Credder back in early 2016, the problem that we were addressing, this kind of decaying trust, this race to the bottom for clicks in media, it wasn't really even known at the time. It was hard to get people to even see value in the mission. So I guess coming full circle, the term fake news that has been thrown around mostly by Trump and his people over the last 4 years, but this term, in some ways, it has revealed a problem that was always there but was never getting its due. And so it could be argued, I guess, and that we're kind of both saying it, that this term, although, it does create certain negative things like maybe the safety of journalists or people's trust in information more broadly, it has created an environment where we can talk seriously about this problem, this what I think of as a kind of a race to the bottom for clicks that begets more clicks and begets more clicks. So I guess in the end, fake news is good in the sense that sometimes a problem needs to get big enough for people to actually turn around and face it. So I have two more questions for you, Mickey. They're questions that I ask every guest at the end of the podcast. But before I get to those, can you give listeners the places where they should go to follow your work or follow Project Censored?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Chase. You can go to projectcensored.org. Media literacy education organization has been around since 1976. Founded at Sonoma State University in Northern California. We're now on over 20 campuses across the United States. We do multimedia productions. I've got a weekly radio show, and Chase occasionally co-hosts that with me there. We're on KPFA out of Berkeley, California, on 50 stations around the U.S. So again, the website is projectcensored.org. We have a lot of other resources at the Global Critical Media Literacy Project, or GCML.org, including a free instructor resource guide on how to teach critical media literacy in the classroom for all different ranges of students. It's free and it's available. And if anybody wants to get in touch with me, Nolan Higdon and I, Andy Roth, Steve Masick and I, we do workshops, we do conferences. So if you're interested, you can get a hold of me at Mickey, like the mouse, at projectcensored.org.
Great, thank you for that. The last two questions, I'm actually curious. I'm not sure we've spoken about these two topics much, so this will be kind of new, and I don't think you watched ahead any of the episodes so far, so these should surprise you a little bit. So first question is Bitcoin. Are you a believer or not so much?
Anything that replicates the current system of currency as mammon in a hierarchical capacity, despite its own libertarian rhetoric of the potential that it holds, I'm highly suspect of it. I understand we need alternative monetary systems, but I, for one, have not been a major proponent of a system that tends to replicate some of the worst features that we see even with the Federal Reserve structure. And this is, of course, a very long and detailed economic topic that I don't have time to get into here. I know you have some involvement and experience with Bitcoin, and I know that you could certainly share with all of your viewers and listeners a different perspective and perhaps a more opportunistic one. And I don't mean that word in a superficial or self-beneficial way. I mean framing these different systems as potential opportunities for people who may have been locked out of other systems. So I want to clarify what I mean connotatively in that regard. In other words, not necessarily for the self-benefit, but for literally creating an alternative system, right? And I think that that's probably where something like Bitcoin is at its most noble, is in its intention, I suppose. But I remain a skeptic of those things, and as somebody that has more than a few anarchist bones in my body, I'm pretty suspect of currency and power structures that are built on them.
Okay, fair enough. And my last question for you today, Mickey, is, are we living in a simulation?
Well, if we are constantly in and out of the screens and we have this hyper reality that people like Jean Baudrillard warned us of, I would say that we are in degrees of simulations. And increasingly, as we are in this more, as Neil Postman called, a technopoly, in a technocratic society, I think that we are more prone to be presented and received as part of a simulacrum. And this is where we get into some interesting parts of postmodern theory that I think relate to media studies in a way that, really do, I think, beg to be analyzed. As Siva Vaidnathan said in his anti-social media book on how Facebook is basically destroying democracy, when you go on it doesn't have to be Facebook. We don't just have to pick on one of these. Any of these platforms has potential to do many things, right? Some of them positive, some of them not so positive, some of them controlling, some of them liberating. But it's how the tools and technologies are controlled and used that's usually the problem. And that's where the devil lies in the details. But what we see is that people now have a media presence, right? It isn't just the television star or the movie star or the radio star or video killing the radio star, right? Everybody's a star. We now have the Warholian. We're not just 15 minutes of fame. We're 280 characters on Twitter, right? And we've had the shortening of that space. But part of the, I think, false promise of the democratization of the technopoly is that we'll all somehow get equal attention and equal space, right? And I don't think that that's what Warhol implied either. I think it's more of a dumbing down superficially and sensationally of the society to where we all blend into the tapestry of the din of a noisy culture that's lacked the ability to analyze itself in a meaningful way. And meaning when we're on social media, it's my image versus your image. Click, like, share. It's my superficial quip and response over your superficial quip and response. And if I have more followers, then I win the day. I think that is part of the simulation that is very dangerous and troublesome and problematic. And you and I know each other, Chase. And as much as I love seeing you here, and I'm grateful that we have these opportunities, I liked it a lot more, even though we talked about a lot less when I saw you in person a week ago, right? If that makes any sense to your viewers or listeners, right? I don't think that there's ever going to be a substitute. I know we're heading fast to the AI world of chip implantation, constant gadget tracking, and I know that there's going to be people saying, but look how cool. I love science fiction, but I also understand that science fiction writers have written us about dystopian warnings for a reason. George Orwell didn't write 1984 because he was enamored with telescreens. He wrote it because it was a warning. It wasn't a blueprint. It was watch out for your own machinations, your own ingenuity. Don't think you're so clever as to not box yourself in to your own panopticon and your own prison and cage. Which is why I think people like Aldous Huxley maybe win the day about us growing to love our own servitude and our own four walls of four screens of social media around us, right? We create our own madhouses of reality, to riff on an old Anthrax song, right? Four walls around us in an empty cage. We've created that digitally and then projected it around the world. But as much as that technology has the ability or pretends to connect us, as we've argued in the United States of Distraction, Chase, I think it's also been used to divide us. And we need to resist the temptation of the confirmation bias, hyperpartisan tendencies of this kind of technology to only relegate ourselves and others to simulations. And I know this has multiple layers of meanings. I'm purposely not going down that last rabbit hole through the looking glass with the red pill, blue pill, because frankly, we probably all need lots of purple pills and different pills altogether. And maybe we should abstain from taking any pills for 30 days and see what happens after that. Meaning it's good to take a break from this technology. It's good to take a break from the constant back and forth of, I'm right, you're wrong, no matter what, vice versa. That's very tiring. I think we don't allow ourselves, and our technology doesn't help us, we don't allow ourselves enough time to think and process. And quite frankly, we don't honor it as a culture. We have a lot of negative terms that we use for people that we think are smart. And then we only define smart in certain ways, right? And media really help propound those stereotypes. And I don't think they do it in a way that mirrors the potential of human tendency and growth. And these very things that we're talking through now are brilliant manifestations of our imagination, but they are also the very chains of bondage that will prevent us from having a paradigm shift to yet another level of greater human understanding. And I think that we're always on the cusp of that. And in the 21st century, our technology is going very fast. But in terms of our perception, is it going much faster than it was 120 years ago with Henry Ford and the Model T? when everybody, was screaming about, we don't need to go any faster. Get off my lawn. We don't need those noisy contraptions. That's never going to go anywhere. Well, the automobile was adapted and adopted. It was also pushed on us by the oil industry and manufacturers for profit. The rest, they say, is history. Is automotive culture all bad? Obviously not. Has it negatively impacted community development in various ways, as demonstrated by people and from geographers like Guns, Germs, and Steel? I'm blanking on his name right now. Can't believe it. I use his material in my classes. Jared Diamond. Or what about Mike Davis and City of Quartz, right? It's not just the technology itself, it's how it's being used and controlled. And so back to your simulation. Whose simulation are we in, right? Who's pulling the levers? As Eddie Bernays said over 100 years ago, who's pulling the wires to control the public mind? The great propagandists never want us to see who's writing the algorithm or the bots. And what I argue in terms of critical media literacy is that the more we understand that, the more we understand the simulations that we are in, and the more we understand to where we're invited and how we want to participate moving forward, if at all. And I think the more empowerment we have that's coming from ourselves independently, I think the better off we might be in the bigger picture or in the long run.
So just to put a cap on that, I guess you would say that we live in reality, but we're in the process of creating all these simulated experiences and simulated lives, and that we seem to be continuously opting for more simulated experiences. That kind of makes sense?
I think that that's certainly what you're seeing in the quote developed world, which is a very biased and hierarchical capitalist kind of language that favors technologically developed countries and populations. Look, again, these very technologies, the rise of modern policing itself was connected to the black codes, slave tracking, and controlling people around the globe. One of the biggest secrets of the underside of Silicon Valley and the entire tech sector is its heavy reliance on slave labor, supply chain slavery, whether it's coltan or gadgets at Foxconn in China. That's what I mean when we talk about peeling back the curtains. It's not just the people in the newsrooms or their corporate paymasters and advertisers. It goes deeper than that, and it goes and looks at the entire global economy. And I think that that's also what critical media literacy does for us, is it allows us to ask those questions and decide, are we willingly participating in this, and can we opt out? Well, increasingly, Chase, it's really hard to opt out of this technocratic world if we're going to live the alleged good life. I'd at least like to ask the unpopular question of, what if we unplug long enough to hear our own voices again and take time to not have FaceTime on Apple, but real FaceTime with you, even at a distance downtown, right? I think there's no substitute for human interaction. And I don't think that there is any substitute for outsourcing human creativity, intelligence to machines. I may be in an increased minority among the technocrats, but that's my story for now, and I'm sticking to it.
All right. Thank you so much again, Mickey, for joining us on this episode of the Credder Podcast. I hope all of our listeners go and follow your work at Project Censored and the Media Freedom Foundation. Mickey, thank you again, and take care. I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Chase, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. ProjectCensored.org.
Take care.